right.
Cardio burns fat, right?
Okay, so first I'd like to just tell you a little bit about InspireHealth, and then I will dive into all of this material I have prepared for you. So InspireHealth is a not-for-profit charity that was founded in 1997, and then we branched out from Vancouver to Victoria and Kelowna. And all along, we've tried to really have a strong virtual presence just to reach more people. So that's something that we've tried to have in place long before COVID, and now we're doing tons of things online. So if you're interested in checking us out further, I have our website at the end of our presentation, and I can tell you more about InspireHealth. So we are funded partially by the BC Ministry of Health, and then we also rely on donations to do what we do. And this allows us to provide all of our services for free, which is one of the things I like best about working for InspireHealth. So all of our one-on-one appointments and all of our groups and workshops are completely free. And we also really try to take an evidence-informed approach to what we do. And we talk a lot about lifestyle, so nutrition and exercise, stress management, and the different aspects of life that people have some control over and some say over. And so this is just a little snippet about what we offer at InspireHealth. We have one-on-one sessions that can be right now on Zoom or on the phone. And those are available with our physicians who are medical doctors with extra background and interest in the field of oncology. We have registered dietitians, we have exercise therapists, and clinical counselors. And then we also offer a variety of online groups that are held. We have at least one thing going every day, every weekday. So we have meditation classes, we have inspired conversations with our counselors, exercise classes, a whole bunch of different ones, yoga and nutrition. And for nutrition, we do nutrition workshops kind of similar to what I'm going to present to you today. Those happen every other Thursday for about an hour and a half. And then we have cooking classes that happen every other Monday for about an hour. And that's all up on our website, inspirehealth.ca. And you can find all of our offerings there. Okay, so this is a little outline of what I'd like to talk to you about today. So I am going to really emphasize the role of whole foods throughout this presentation, and I'll talk to you a bit about what I mean about whole foods, and then we'll talk a bit about blood sugar. And so this is very much along the lines of this question, does sugar feed cancer? Which I would say is probably one of the most widely asked questions that I get when I work with people. So I'm hoping that by the end of our presentation today, you'll have more information about that question and about kind of the nuances of that question and how it's difficult to answer with just kind of a simple yes or no. But I'll talk about the benefits of keeping blood sugar levels stable and how we can do that. I'll discuss the impact of carbohydrates, of sugar, sugars, different types of sugars, and fiber. And I'll give you some tips about eating to balance blood sugar. I'll do a little bit of a research review. There were a couple of articles that Len shared with me that were really useful. So I'll go through some key highlights there, and I'll just tie that into what I've been discussing about sugar and prostate cancer specifically. And then I have some specific nutrition recommendations for prostate cancer, and then a few tidbits about just putting this all together. How does it look in everyday life? All right, so whole foods. Whole foods, really the way that we like to think about this at InspireHealth is foods that come complete with all the parts and pieces that we need to maintain good health. So these might be foods that you can picture growing or raising or harvesting or hunting. And when you imagine the foods, you can visualize how they might have been produced versus maybe foods that have been constructed in a lab somewhere. So typically whole foods are minimally processed and they come in their most natural form. And this really contributes a lot of the time to nutrient density, having more nutrient density in these whole foods. And when we eat foods that are more nutrient dense, we get a lot more bang for our buck, so to speak, with the foods that we're putting into our bodies. So I'd like to just give you a little snippet about the macronutrients, and this will become important as we move forward in the discussion today about blood sugar. So carbohydrates are the main source of fuel for the brain and for the body. Some whole food sources of carbohydrates would be all of our fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and beans. And then proteins really provide more of the structure of the body. They help with healing, they help with tissue repair, so after any type of surgeries. And some sources of whole foods would be beans, and you might notice that these are also included in the carbohydrate category. So beans are one of those foods that offer a nice balance between carbohydrates and proteins. And most foods that you see here will have, a little bit of carbohydrate, some protein, some fat. But I sort of categorize these in terms of what they seem to contain most of. So beans, good balance between protein and carbohydrates. Nuts and seeds would be in this protein category. Traditional soy foods, so things like tofu or tempeh or edamame. Fish and meat and eggs would be protein sources. And then fats are very useful for helping to maintain our brain cells, for a sense of satisfaction with our meals, for body insulation, and for all of the cell membranes in the body. Some whole food sources of fats would be avocado, olive oil, nuts and seeds, and you'll see the nuts and seeds up there in the protein as well. So there's kind of a balance there between some protein, some fat in nuts and seeds. Fatty fish would be a good source of whole food fats, olives, and butter. Okay, so now diving into what is blood sugar. The foods that we eat, and primarily carbohydrates, turn into blood sugar or blood glucose. So the fats and the proteins that I've just spoken about really have a very minimal direct impact in terms of blood sugar, but they can have a very supportive role, which I'll talk about in subsequent slides. So when we eat these carbohydrate foods and we turn them into this blood glucose, that glucose is then carried to all of our cells, and that's what we use to help produce energy. We know that blood glucose levels fluctuate throughout the day. So they rise after we've eaten something, and then they drop between meals. They're also usually lowest when we first wake up in the morning. And I have some graphs that I'll show you to help to illustrate this even better. The body typically regulates its blood glucose levels on its own, and it does this quite well so that the blood glucose is neither too high nor too low. Insulin is an important hormone that helps with the glucose regulation process. So you can think of insulin, if you see this little graphic over here on the right, insulin really acts as the key to help let glucose into the cell at this receptor door here. So insulin is so important for just being this escort to glucose so that it can actually make its way into the cell. Right, and so why is it important to keep blood sugar levels stable. Well, we know that over-consuming sugars or very sweet foods or foods that contain a lot of readily accessible carbohydrates can cause this constant demand for insulin in the body. And the body can sometimes have a hard time keeping up with this demand for insulin. So sometimes cells can become desensitized to insulin if this is happening a lot. And then we can see some health issues like insulin resistance or something like prediabetes. You can think of this as, going back to this previous slide, so if we have a lot of glucose in the bloodstream that needs to make its way into the cell, we need quite a bit of insulin to try to help with that process. And so if we're having these really high levels of glucose in the blood a lot of the time, you can think of this as insulin is sort of there at the receptor door, and it's almost like insulin is, ringing the doorbell over and over and over again. And if someone rings your doorbell over and over and over again, you might really get tired of that, and you might want to stop coming to the door at that point. So that is when we can start to see this insulin resistance, where the cells become resistant to that process of letting the glucose in, and then we're less efficient with being able to produce energy, and we have these higher levels of insulin in the body and higher levels of glucose in the bloodstream, which isn't great for health. So we know that in terms of cancer, chronically elevated blood sugar and insulin levels can promote this environment that can allow cancer to thrive. And this is just one of many factors that can promote this type of environment. But I think the important thing is that there's something that we can do about it. And I think that's really empowering, knowing that this is one of those factors that we can have some say over to help reduce the likelihood that cancer would want to proliferate in the body. Okay, so here is an example of kind of an ideal blood sugar level. So we have blood sugar over time, and this green here represents the blood sugar. So ideally, we wake up in the morning and our blood glucose is pretty low. So we eat a balanced breakfast, and then our blood glucose rises. Our body will release some insulin to help get that glucose into the cell. And then we'll see that blood glucose decrease. And then maybe it's mid-morning, we've used up that morning glucose, and so we eat a snack. We feel a bit hungry here. And so then that blood glucose rises again, our body releases some insulin. That helps to get the glucose into the cells, so the blood glucose will decrease. And then we feel hungry again. We've used up that snack glucose, so we have lunch, and that process continues on. And this is all, we're kind of staying within this optimal window here with our blood glucose levels. So then, in contrast to that, I'd like to show you, so this graph represents the impact of having refined carbohydrates. And I'll talk a lot more about what that means, refined carbohydrates. But for example, let's say that we wake up in the morning and we have some white toast with some jam and with some orange juice. So in that meal, we're not really getting very much fiber. And there's quite a bit of carbohydrate in that meal. So the body is getting a pretty good dose of carbohydrates all at once that it will go through pretty quickly. So that blood glucose is rising pretty quickly, and we have to release some insulin. And sometimes if the glucose in the blood is rising quite quickly, the insulin that we release can overshoot the mark a little bit. So we might see this blood glucose level then kind of going a bit further down than would be optimal for us. So then maybe we feel like, oh wow, I'm starving. I really need something else right now. And so we might reach for more refined carbohydrates potentially. And then we might just really get on this roller coaster of the high ups and the low lows. which over time can be something that is not great for health and can be one of those things that kind of promotes that environment for cancer. So we know that, as I was saying, too much sugar that's released, that's consumed at one time can lead to production and release of excess insulin, and then we get on this roller coaster pattern. And we know that that's also associated with inflammation in the body. And inflammation is one of those factors that can also set the stage for something like cancer. Okay, so what do we do about this? How do we shift this pattern? So we know that diet is really a major factor in stabilizing blood sugar levels. And as I was saying earlier on, the foods that we eat fall into these three main categories: carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And also, as I mentioned, carbohydrates have more of a direct impact on blood sugar, protein more of a minimal direct impact, and fat doesn't really have any direct impact on blood sugar. And so each of those macronutrients, the carbohydrates, protein, and fat, breaks down at a different rate. So first, this green line here represents carbohydrates, where if we eat some carbohydrate on its own, it's going to, we're going to break that down, fairly quickly, and then we might kind of run out of energy a bit sooner. But then if we add some protein to that carbohydrate, so let's say we had some rice as our carbohydrate, and then we add some protein, maybe we have some chickpeas or we have some chicken or something like that, that will mean that we're breaking down those carbohydrates more slowly over time. So the protein means that our body has to kind of work through both the protein and the carbohydrate, and that means we're releasing the carbohydrate more slowly over time. We're getting a bit more gradual increase in the blood sugar, and then we're getting a bit more gradual leveling off at the end there. And so that might feel as though it lasts us a little bit longer. We might not get hungry as quickly. And then if we add some fat to that meal, so maybe we have our rice, we have our chicken or our chickpeas, and then we add some avocado on top of there. So that would take the longest of all of these meals in order for us to break down. So that means those carbohydrates are going to be released even more slowly into the body. So more of a gradual increase in blood glucose, and then more of a gradual leveling off. And that's actually really the ideal scenario for what we would like blood sugar to look like. So, more of a gradual rise, more of a gradual leveling off. And so this kind of the take-home message, which I'll talk about in a number of different ways, is to aim to eat a consistent supply of all three of these macronutrients. So whenever you're having a source of carbohydrates, if you compare that with some protein and with some fat, that will be better for maintaining a better level of blood sugar regulation. Okay, so as I've mentioned, all carbohydrates are not really created equal. So we have more of the refined carbohydrates that are digested and released into the bloodstream very quickly. Some examples of this would be white flour or white rice, white sugar, white pasta, and fruit juice. And you can see some examples in the picture up here on the right. And then this would be in contrast to our whole food carbohydrates. Most whole food carbohydrates are going to come packaged with fiber. And so that's something that I haven't mentioned yet, but I guess I have mentioned that a bit on one slide, several slides back, but I'll talk more about fiber. So fiber is another one of those factors, in addition to protein and fat, that will help to slow down the release of those carbohydrates into our bloodstream. So whenever we can look for those carbohydrates that are packaged with the fiber, that's really beneficial because it takes the body longer to kind of make its way through that fiber, in addition to the protein and the fats compared to carbohydrates that don't naturally contain that fiber. So we would find fiber in things like whole grains, beans, peas, lentils, all of our vegetables and fruits. Okay, so this is another way of illustrating fiber. So if you think about this picture over here on the left, this being one single whole grain, so maybe 1 grain of something like brown rice or 1 grain of whole wheat. So this outer layer here is that the bran layer that really is the fiber. And then next, within that grain, so as we're looking at the inside of the grain, we have the endosperm, which is largely starch plus a little bit of protein. So this is where, this is kind of that major carbohydrate component of the grain. And then on the very inside, we have the germ that has some vitamins, some minerals, some oils. It's beneficial. And so some examples of these whole grain carbohydrates could be, as I said, the brown rice, the whole wheat, things like quinoa or buckwheat or oats or wild rice. There are lots of different examples of whole grains. And so this is what our grain would look like if it were refined. So something like white flour. So if we're looking back here, this would be an example of what we might find in like whole wheat flour, where the entire grain has been ground down and then it's been used in certain products or it's ready for us to use. But this would be an example of a refined grain, something like white flour, where that bran and the germ have been completely removed. So we're just left with the endosperm. So largely that starch and a little bit of protein. So something like white flour, white rice, white pasta doesn't have any of that fiber to help slow the release of these carbohydrates into the bloodstream. So that can have the tendency to spike the blood glucose levels a bit more quickly. Right. Okay, so the role of fiber. Fiber is really this health promoting component of whole food carbohydrates. And fiber can help with controlling the blood sugar levels, as we talked about. It also really helps with enhancing our natural elimination and detoxification process. So basically helping things to move through the digestive system more easily and more readily, which is important for all kinds of body systems. But we also feel a lot better if we're properly eliminating, if we're having bowel movements on a daily basis. Fiber can help with meal satisfaction, so it can help us to feel full and satisfied longer after a meal because it's taking longer for us to break down that fiber as our body is digesting it. It can help with lowering blood lipid levels. So if you struggle with high cholesterol or triglycerides, having more sources of fiber in your diet can help a lot with managing some of those cholesterol or triglyceride levels. And then we also know that fiber can help with strengthening the immune system. And this is related to its impact on all of our gut microbes. So the good bacteria that we have in our digestive system, they feed on fiber and they really thrive on that fiber. And we really want to keep them happy because they help a lot with producing these compounds that then can support our immune system, can enhance our immune system. And if you're curious more about all of our gut microbes, there's a talk that we do pretty often at InspireHealth about the gut microbiome. And it's a whole, really fascinating area. Okay, so then fiber comes in these two varieties, and we know that both varieties are beneficial to health. So first we have soluble fiber, which dissolves in water. And this is the one that particularly can help with lowering glucose levels and with controlling blood cholesterol levels. So some sources of soluble fiber would be oatmeal, barley, beans, lentils, apples, blueberries, and chia seeds. So these things, when water is added to them, they sort of bulk up. And that's useful as that type of fiber moves through our digestive system because it pulls more water into the colon, and then it can help promote bowel movements in a useful way. Then we have insoluble fiber, which does not dissolve in water. So if you picture cutting up something like celery and adding water to it, that would be a good example of insoluble fiber. But it's almost like a kind of a scrub brush for the intestines that can help with moving material through the intestines. And it also can have some antioxidant benefits. So some sources of insoluble fiber would be some of those bran layers. And I should say also that both the insoluble and the soluble fiber have this role to play with helping to lower glucose levels, blood glucose levels, because they're both going to take longer for us to digest than if we just eat carbohydrates that don't really contain that fiber. So all of the bran layers on our whole grains, legumes, the kind of the outer layer of those beans will contain insoluble fiber, leafy greens, and then the peels of veggies and fruits are quite high in insoluble fiber. And just one quick tip about, if you're really excited about adding more fiber to your diet, that's exciting to me as well, but I would just recommend that you do so gradually and also make sure that you're getting enough water during the day. So you might notice that if you're adding more fiber to your diet, you might need to also increase your hydration just to make sure that that fiber is making its way through properly. Okay, so this is, I know this looks like kind of a busy slide, but I'll explain more about what's going on here. So I just want to illustrate a couple of things here. So this red curve that you can see, this is another example of you eat something that has, so this meal here, you're eating this meal with some that just contains some sugary food. So let's say you're having some Halloween candy on an empty stomach. You might see this pretty quick spike in your blood glucose levels, and then you'll see a quick drop. So maybe you feel pretty hungry 30 to 60 minutes later after having that, if you make a meal of Halloween candy. But then, so this next curve here, this yellow curve, would be your body's response to some refined carbohydrates. So maybe it's not these sugary foods like Halloween candy, but maybe it's something like some white pasta, white flour pasta with just a little bit of sauce on there. So we don't have much protein or fat with that meal. So with that, we would see, compared to the sugary foods, we would see a bit more of a gradual increase in the blood sugar, and then a bit more of a gradual decline. But maybe you're hungry 1 to 2 hours later, and we've also kind of gone outside of this range, the green dotted lines, of the healthy window for blood sugar, where we'd optimally like to keep the blood sugar at all times. So then the blue line here would be your body's response if you have a meal that contains some whole grains, maybe some fruits and veggies, maybe some legumes. So an example could be maybe you have some brown rice and you have some greens on top of there, and you have some chickpeas or lentils, and you have some avocado on top of there. So we're getting some good carbohydrates with fiber, with protein, and with fat. So we have more of this gradual increase in blood sugar, and then more of a gradual leveling off. And maybe you don't feel hungry until 3 or 4 hours later. Okay, so let's go through just a comparison to make this a bit more real when you're going to the grocery store. So we'll talk about white bread versus whole grain bread, and I'll tell you what I typically look for when I'm at the grocery store. So this is our white bread, and you have the nutrition facts here. So first I look at, how many servings are we talking about? And this is actually, we're looking at 2 slices of bread for our serving in the nutrition facts. And then there are some things that I don't really pay much attention to on here, but there are a few key areas that I try to hone in on. So fiber is one. So we have 1 gram of fiber per 2 slices of bread. So we have a half a gram of fiber per slice of bread. And then we have 3 grams of sugar per 2 slices of bread. So that's not a huge amount of sugar, but it's good to know. And then I like to look at the ingredients list. So when it comes to bread, I really look at this very first ingredient. And when you hear enriched wheat flour, that's a bit of a marketing trick to make you think that that wheat flour is maybe a little bit more nutritious than it actually is. But this enriched wheat flour is actually telling us that that's just white flour because it doesn't actually include the word whole there. So it doesn't say enriched whole wheat flour. And actually, usually when a flour is enriched, it means that some of those outer layers have been pulled off of the grain. And so they're adding some nutrients, some vitamins and minerals back in to that flour to account for some things that have been taken away in the processing. Okay, so instead we would like to look for something like whole wheat flour. And I'll show you, so this is an example of some whole grain bread. So here, in comparison, we have just 1 slice of bread compared to the 2 slices on the previous slide. But in that 1 slice of bread, we have 4 grams of fiber compared to just a half a gram of fiber in 1 slice of bread on the previous slide. And then we have no sugars in this 1 slice of bread. So that's also useful to know that we're just limiting the amount of extra sugars that we might be taking in. And here's the ingredient list. So we see here sprouted wheat. And I know in the previous slide, I just recommended looking for whole wheat flour, but this is also another option. If we see something like sprouted wheat, that actually means that it is the whole grain. They're sprouting the whole wheat. So you're getting that entire grain. So looking for something like sprouted wheat or whole wheat, those are some things, some keywords that will help as you're at the grocery store trying to sift through, what kind of bread do I buy? And also just checking out that fiber, seeing if you can find the bread that has the highest amount of fiber in it. And that will help to ensure that the carbohydrates are released into your bloodstream more slowly over time. And then I'll show you as well just oh yes, okay, so my little tip here is to try to look for bread that contains about 3 or 4 grams of fiber per slice, if you can. Okay, so then I have a cereal comparison, one other grocery shopping comparison for you here. So in our cereal number 1, we have a serving size of 3/4 of a cup, 28 grams, and we have 2 grams of fiber, and then we have 9 grams of sugar. And just to actually give you a little idea of what 9 grams of sugar is, 4 grams of sugar is a teaspoon. So you're kind of picturing dumping a couple of teaspoons onto your cereal, a couple of teaspoons plus a bit. And here's the ingredient list. So I like the fact that we have some whole grain oats as our first ingredient. And then we also have some oat bran in there. But then what I also notice is that sugar happens to be the second ingredient in this cereal. And then we also have honey, and we also have brown sugar syrup. So we have 3 different kinds of sugar that have been added to this cereal. And then let's look at our cereal number 2. So this is for 2 biscuits. So that's 40 grams of this cereal. We have 5 grams of fiber here compared to our 2 grams of fiber in cereal number 1. And we have 0 grams of sugar compared to our 9 grams of sugar. And we're actually getting more here in this serving because the serving size in cereal number 1 was 28 grams. And then the ingredients here are just whole wheat. That's all that it is. And so those are some key things I try to look for when I'm assessing cereal in the grocery store. I try to find a cereal that has 5 grams of fiber or more per serving and 3 grams of sugar or less per serving. All right, so maintaining balance, just recapping a few things that we've talked about. If we can choose carbohydrates from whole food sources, we're going to be getting those carbohydrates that are already packaged with some good fiber. And that's really useful for blood sugar balance. We're balancing those carbohydrates along with some protein and fat. So eating carbohydrates, protein, and fat together at a meal or a snack. And then when we do choose carbohydrates that are refined, because we all have birthday parties and celebrations when we'd like to have some of those refined carbohydrates, but maybe we're thinking about pairing those refined carbohydrates along with some protein and fat. So maybe you have a handful of nuts with your chocolate bar, and that can help to offset some of the impact of the sugar in the chocolate bar. Protein, fat, and carbohydrates help to slow the release of glucose into the bloodstream and help with managing appetite, so helping to keep us full and satisfied longer. Okay, so I want to just get into a couple of the articles that Len had sent to me so that I can talk to you a bit about some of the key points here. So this first article, and these were both posted on the Prostate Cancer Foundation.org site. So this first one was titled Prostate Cancer's Sweet Tooth. So one of the key points in that article was that high blood glucose levels and high insulin levels may create this environment for cancer to thrive. So it's helpful to reduce those refined sugars, as we've talked about in this presentation, thinking about reducing sugary drinks and reducing refined carbohydrates as much as we can. And instead, we're choosing lots of vegetables. We're choosing health-promoting fats like fish, avocado, olive oil. We're having moderate amounts of protein, and we're choosing whole fruit. So instead of orange juice, maybe we're going for the whole orange instead. And that was really avoiding sugary drinks, including juice, was something that was spoken about at length in this article. So I think, all of those points are so useful and very much in alignment of what we try to speak about at InspireHealth. And then this second article was about sugar and sugar substitutes. So some of the key points here were thinking about reducing our reliance on sweet and sugary foods over time. And what's interesting is that our taste buds can actually acclimate to lower levels of sugar over time. So if you start cutting down on some of those sugary foods you might have in your diet, you'll notice that your taste buds become much more sensitive to the sweet tastes. And then if you go back and have some of those sugary foods again, they might taste just very, very, very sweet. So things like honey, date sugar, coconut sugar, maple syrup, these all still do have an impact on our blood glucose and on the insulin. So it's kind of considered in the category of still trying to reduce our reliance on some of those types of sweet foods like honey and some of these alternative sugars. But stevia and monk fruit do not seem to have an impact on blood sugar or on on blood glucose levels, and they seem to be safe. There aren't really safety concerns about them. Things like sorbitol and xylitol, these are some of the sugar alcohols you might see in food products. And we know that those can contribute to gastrointestinal distress, particularly gas and bloating and diarrhea. Artificial sweeteners, so things like saccharin and aspartame, there's some thought that they may actually contribute to cancer. This is a finding that has come up in studies with mice, and it's harder to translate this to humans, but there's some concern that if we're finding that in mice, maybe we should be concerned about having higher amounts of these artificial sweeteners. And there's also, they can negatively impact our gut microbiome, so all of those gut microbes that we're trying to support. And the artificial sweeteners can still stimulate our insulin response, the insulin release. So it's not like the artificial sweeteners have no impact at all. So I think this all just kind of points back to that point number one of seeing if we can reduce our reliance on sweet and sugary foods over time. All right, so I'm coming near to the end of my presentation, and I just want to give you a few prostate cancer specific nutrition recommendations. And then I have a couple of summary slides, and I'd be happy to take any questions. So lycopene is this component. It gives foods this, some foods, this red color. So things like tomatoes, pink grapefruit, guava, and watermelon. We know that that nutrient is super helpful for working against prostate cancer and helping to prevent prostate cancer. So the more that you can include these foods in your diet, the better. And then flax seeds. So these are very small little seeds that can be ground up, and you actually get more benefit from them if they are ground. And the recommendation is to have something like 3 tablespoons of flaxseed a day. There's some thought that this can help to reduce tumor proliferation, prostate cancer tumor proliferation, and that flax seeds can help to lower PSA. So flax seeds, I think, are pretty delicious, and you can add them on top. You can add them to oatmeal. You can add them on top of yogurt. You can sprinkle them in salads. There are all kinds of ways to use them. Selenium, so this is another nutrient specific to prostate cancer that's thought to be really healthy. And if you are able to have 2 Brazil nuts a day, you will be meeting your needs for selenium, which I think is a pretty tasty way to get your selenium. But you can also find selenium in fish and seafood. Vitamin E, so having things like almonds, sunflower seeds, avocado, all of these are helpful for boosting your vitamin E levels and helpful for working against prostate cancer. And then vitamin D, if you can think about having about 1,000 to 2,000 international units of vitamin D per day, that's ideal. And that will help to support bone health and to support immune health. And this is the one that I usually recommend getting from a supplement instead of trying to look for food sources, just because it's so hard to get vitamin D in food form to get the amount that we actually need of it. And then calcium. So this one as well, if we can aim for 1,000 to 2,000 milligrams per day coming from food and supplements, that is ideal for bone health. But then also it's thought to be really impactful for anyone who's had prostate cancer, and just helping to ensure that you're creating this body environment that would be less hospitable to something like prostate cancer. And so this is a great resource. And even if you just go to osteoporosis.ca, you can find this calculator, calcium calculator, where you can enter what your food looks like for a day, and it will tell you about how much calcium you're getting. And then you could think about a supplement if you need to bump up that level to meet the 1,000 to 1,200 per day. In general, thinking of plants as the foundation of what you're eating most of the time, getting in some physical activity, decreasing stress, all of these things can be very helpful for supporting the body at any point in time when someone is experiencing or has experienced prostate cancer. All right, so just a couple of thoughts on putting it all together. We're thinking about reducing the white stuff, reducing the white and the brown sugar, reducing white rice, white bread, white pasta, and other refined products. We're thinking about reducing sugary cereals and refined flour baked goods, reducing sugary drinks when we can. I'm thinking about using nutrient-dense fats, fiber, and protein to balance the effects of things like brownies when we do feel like having them. Maybe we have those brownies with some walnuts in them. And we're thinking about focusing on these whole foods that are packaged with all this lovely fiber, fruits and veggies, whole grains, nuts, seeds, legumes, quality animal products, including fiber-rich carbohydrates, protein, fat with each meal or snack. Eating a balanced breakfast, kind of starting off the day with some balance there, and then eating at regular intervals, at regular times throughout the day. Okay, so just a little note on how InspireHealth can support you. We are here with lots of different things to offer. We can support on all kinds of different dietary questions. We love to go through, personal food diaries with people and provide individual recommendations. We have lots of recipes on our website, and we're here to support people at any point along the way with any cancer diagnosis. So whether that's early on or it's been 15 years since a cancer diagnosis. And as I said, all of our services right now are being offered on Zoom or on the phone. Oops. And yes, and so you can find more about us at inspirehealth.ca. And this is also my email. If you have any questions at all, I would be happy to answer your questions via email, or as you think about this information and mull it over, you would be welcome to email me. And I would love to take your questions now, anything that's come up as I've gone through this presentation.